Chicago on Stage was made possible in part by the Theater Years Chicago project of the Joseph Jefferson Awards Committee. Theater Years Chicago was partially supported by grants from the Illinois Arts Council, a state agency, and by the Illinois Humanities Council.
First thing that struck me when I first went to LA, and I had never been there until about 6 years ago, they really respect actors that come out of Chicago.
It was a nice place to start. It was a kinder place to start.
And it's home in some way. I mean, even if you don't live there.
And you can't talk about American theater without talking about the talent that emerges from Chicago.
Did you really want to hear what that teacher had to say?
What the hell does that mean? You think I don't want to clear this case?
Hey, all I know, I partnered with the greatest social worker since that nun from Calcutta. But he always made sure the cop part got done.
And the Emmy goes to Dennis Franz.
Hi, I'm Dennis Franz. When I was a kid growing up around Chicago, the thought of something like that ever happening to me was beyond my wildest imagination. But I guess I should have known better, because Chicago has produced some of the biggest names in show business. Comedians like Bill Murray and John Belushi, film actors like John Malkovich, Joe Mantegna and Gary Sinise, and TV stars like Laurie Metcalf, John Mahoney, and Meshack Taylor. There's something about Chicago theater people that America loves. They're not thinking about fame and fortune. They're just trying to please the audience and pay the bills. But every year, a few more of them make it big in movies and TV. This is a story about a town full of small stages and big dreams.
I remember back in the late 60s, early 70s, if you went out of town with a show from Chicago, if you went to New York, the attitude was, you're from Chicago, they kind of expected you to walk in with like a piece of wheat sticking out of your mouth and a cow behind you or something. Then all of a sudden it went the other direction. And then there was a time when if you said you were from Chicago, it was almost like you were like saying you were from England or some other mysterious place. Like, oh, you're from Chicago, you must be a wonderful, terrific actor, and blah, blah, blah.
We got that label stuck on us about the Chicago style of acting or something. I think that started with Steppenwolf probably, you know, energetic, crazy, wild, threatening, you know, whatever, loose, ugly.
There, now you got your keys back. Oh, and there's your keys.
I don't know what a Chicago style is. I'm just talking about what we were interested in. The bottom line was we were a group of actors who just wanted to act and develop a very realistic kind of style of acting.
You must be my FNGs.
Morning, sir.
Oh, get your hands down. Do not salute me. There are damn snipers all around this area who love to grease an officer.
I think that the Chicago style of acting is much more straightforward.
The sucker is gone. G-O-N-E 86 over and out. Here's your ottoman back.
That's a very Chicago thing. It's just a naturalness, I guess.
Seems like I'm always being told to take my feet off the furniture, put a coaster under my beer, turn the TV down. I used to make the rules, and now I have to follow them.
Very high level of respect that I found. You know, just they assume you know what you're doing if you've done theater in Chicago.
Even though a lot of well-known artists have come out of Chicago's theater scene, most Chicago theaters aren't exactly conspicuous. They don't have fancy marquees or glamorous opening nights. They're in old storefronts and basements and garages. And they're not downtown, they're out here in the neighborhoods. They sort of blend in with the street. So do the actors who work in those theaters. We're not exactly our matinee idol types.
The Cubs ain't playing right today yet. I was betting on the way they were playing yesterday.
You're not trying to cancel our bet now, are you?
Well, I did it. Come on,
That unglamorous quality just might be the secret of our success. At least that's what Jane Alderman thinks. She's a casting director who finds Chicago actors for movies and television.
They want Chicago actors because there is that all-American, Midwestern, unencumbered human being in their mind. And there's also a look. It's not a very slick, actory look here. Sometimes, you know, people will walk down the street in Manhattan or Los Angeles, you go, that's an actor, I can tell. They're very theatrical. And here, your most renowned actors aren't theatrical. They don't look like actors. They look like schlugs or schleps, you know, it doesn't matter. They're everything.
I think that's the way we are here. I think it's a blue-collar approach to things, and there's very little pretense in it.
I think you could win the Pulitzer in this town, and you know, Joe at the liquor store would still treat you the same way. It wouldn't mean anything to him.
It always was to me a workers' town, a town of people who worked for a living and weren't particularly fond of nonsense. They wanted to laugh at the comedies and weep at the tragedies and be engrossed in the drama, and they didn't care about performance art and fashion. And it's a magnificent place to work in the theater.
The growth of theater in Chicago over the last 25 to 30 years has been truly astonishing. In 1969, a committee of actors formed to encourage local theater by giving out the Joseph Jefferson Award. That first year, there were fewer than 10 theaters in the running. In 1994, the Jeff Committee judged almost 100 theaters. Of course, theater existed in Chicago long before the Jeff Awards. The city's first professional actor, none other than Joseph Jefferson himself, arrived by boat in 1838.
At sunrise, we are all on deck. And there in the morning light on the shores of Lake Michigan stands the little town of Chicago, containing 2,000 inhabitants. With what delight the actors looked forward to the opening of a new theater in a new town, where dramatic entertainments were still unknown.
Up until the Second World War, Chicago theater was dominated by those famous big-shouldered tycoons, interested in building huge playhouses, bringing stars to town, and making money. But there were exceptions. In 1905, the country's first African-American stock company, the Pekin Theater, began a strong tradition of black theater in Chicago. In the teens and 20s, the Little Theater movement presented daring experimental plays and classics. In the 40s and 50s, Chicago Tribune critic Claudia Cassidy was feared and admired everywhere. She blasted troops that dared to bring second-rate shows to her town and promoted great talent when she saw it. Playwright Tennessee Williams debuted The Glass Menagerie in Chicago. Cassidy fell in love with it, and the play and its author became American classics. As America entered the 50s, theater seemed to decline in Chicago. Maybe it was the growth of movies and television. Maybe the old-time moguls just decided to take their money somewhere else. Whatever the reasons, the stage was set for the little homegrown troops that would make Chicago famous.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Second City. Tonight, we're very pleased to bring you scenes from the Second City directly here in Chicago in the Cabaret nightclub.
You know why this place is called Second City? Because A.J. Liebling wrote a snotty series of articles in the New Yorker magazine calling it the Second City. And so we took on the snottiness and called ourselves the Second City.
We must experiment, yeah? All right. Now, for the experiment, what do we need?
We need a nightclub audience.
We have a nightclub audience?
Yeah.
We have the instrument?
Yeah.
So we try.
Oh, I'll take notes.
Take notes, Gerhard. Professor?
The Second City grew out of an earlier group formed at the University of Chicago called the Playwrights Theater Club and its successor, the Compass Players. They created scenes through improvisation, making up their lines as they went along, sometimes based on suggestions from the audience. They satirized Chicago politics and sports teams, lampooned U of C intellectuals, and poked fun at high art. Second City performers, from Barbara Harris and Alan Arkin to Mike Nichols and Elaine May, would go on to influence the entire entertainment industry.
See, Gerhard, I told you could play Bach in a nightclub and people will listen, yeah?
You know, it was weird. We weren't fish nor fowl. We weren't a musical review, and we weren't stand-up comedians, and it wasn't a play, and like there's no cubbyhole in which to put us, of course, because that was, you know, something original, finally.
For now, Pam, just come over here, put your hands like this, give me your hands here, and put them up under there, get the ball from Throckmorton and give it off to Morgenstern. All right, let's see if we get that much play off here. All right, here we go. Signals, 1, 2, 3, hike! No, hike, you'd be right in there to get that ball. Come on, right up there. Body contact, little body contact, drive in there. Come on, right up there. Come on, get that ball. Get that ball. Come on, get in there. Come on, your ball side, get in there.
it.
Why not?
Because I hardly know him.
Ladies and gentlemen, as Americans, I think it's very important that we all roll up our shirt sleeves and look
Hey,
at...
Clint, you suck.
We need a doctor here! A doctor!
But I am not his primary care physician.
Today, Second City has 3 Chicago companies, 2 in the city and 1 in the suburbs, 3 touring companies, and a branch in Toronto. The method behind the madness of Second City is a system of theater games. The games were developed in the 1940s by a woman named Viola Spolin, who was teaching theater to children and immigrant workers at Chicago's Hull House. Spolin's son, Paul Sills, was one of the founders of Second City. Sills now lives on this farm in Wisconsin, and every now and then his neighbors coax him out of retirement to put on a show.
Add more parts of the body. There you go. Go back and forth without my saying. Whoever initiates, the other follows.
At this rehearsal, Sills is practicing the games with some original Second City performers.
Get going. You got to get a whole thing up there to get to this. The games, my mother's system. She used play. She was indoctrinated with play. The idea of play is a very important thing in the world. So she devised games. She took the things you have to do on stage and made a game out of it.
And it's not about winning or losing the game, it's about playing the rule. And the rules are rules that help you understand character, they help you understand environment, or they help you understand behavior, or whatever it is.
Yeah, take a topic.
Give us a topic.
One speaks in gibberish, and the other translates, is the interpreter. No more can we have nudniks. We want happy people, smiling, charming, personable people. People with clean teeth. It's not truly about entertainment in itself. It's about concentration or focusing yourself. That's what it's about.
No, the only way I can put it is it's the creative act. It's a three-dimensional creative act. You trust your intuitive.
All the men and women squeeze together. You gotta admit, it's a good time.
Well, all right, now.
For me, it's a great joy to do it because it gets me in contact with all the basic roots of my imagination and my youth and Chicago, where I come from.
We're going to do an exercise called gibberish.
Today, theater games in one form or another are a fundamental part of actor training almost everywhere.
Toss it! Oh, no!
This is a first-year acting class at the Theater School of DePaul University, founded as the Goodman School of Drama in 1925, which has graduated such actors as Carl Malden, Geraldine Page, and Joe Mantegna. Like most colleges and conservatories, DePaul uses improvisation as one component of the overall acting program. But for students who want to specialize in improvisation, there are several famous schools in Chicago, like Players Workshop or Improv Olympic. Second City even has its own training center. Taken together, Chicago Improv has turned out a who's who of American entertainment.
Cheeseburger, 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 cheeseburger. No fries, chicken.
John Belushi, Dan Aykroyd, and Bill Murray were all in Second City companies, as were many other Saturday Night Live greats. John Candy came out of Second City too, and so did Shelley Long and George Wendt.
Second City might be considered like the Harvard Law of comedy, you know what I mean?
But Second City is by no means the only theater game in town. Julia Louis-Dreyfus started with the practical theater in the early 1980s.
I hooked up with these guys when I was at Northwestern, and there was an improv show, and it was a sketch show, and that's how we sort of became friends and started doing things that made us laugh.
John Cusack was raised on improvisation. He began in the children's company at a school run by two of Paul Sills' early players, Joyce and Bern Piven.
I think a lot of the stuff that I learned when I was with the Pivens as a kid was really priceless and invaluable because
it always comes back to sort of guarding and protecting your instincts. A lot of people have come out of their school. Let's see, Rosanna Arquette, Aidan Quinn, me and my sister Joni, Lily Taylor. A lot of people have studied with them.
Improv has always appealed to theater rebels. Now a new underground fringe is rebelling against traditional improv itself. This is the Annoyance Theater, which has produced cult hits like Co-Ed Prison Sluts and The Real Live Brady Bunch.
I would guess we're probably perceived as trash theater. But yeah, I think improv's always had kind of a ruffian, naughty boy kind of feel to it. The legitimate theater community has a difficult time accepting improvisation as an art form.
But when you have an entire city full of people who've studied improvisation, it's got to have some effect.
But improvisation is only part of the Chicago theater story. The city is also famous for the in-your-face acting style of the Steppenwolf Theater, where stars like John Malkovich, Gary Sinise, Laurie Metcalf, Joan Allen, Glenn Headley, and John Mahoney started their careers. Before Steppenwolf came along, several important groups were already testing the limits of traditional theater. Hull House, where Viola Spolin developed theater games, had a long history of fostering amateur theater. In the mid-60s, Hull House asked Philadelphian Bob Sickinger to develop theaters in neighborhoods throughout the city.
It was a wilderness. There was nothing. There was nothing going on. There was a few attempts with Bernie Salins with Second City with the Compass Players, and that was about it.
And somehow or other, he was able to create a company of local, non-professional actors.
And I was never any kind of requisite on my part is that you had to be like an actor. I never required that. All I wanted was someone who had a desire to give their blood on the stage, so to speak. I think it was like 2 hours to clean up the stage after we were finished when the production thing was a production called Until the Monkey Comes. It used to become so fearsome, the energy, and one of their jobs was to tear the whole stage apart, and which they did every night.
One of the stagehands who had to clean up the message night was a teenager who grew up to be one of the most important playwrights of the 20th century.
I met David Mamet at the Hull House Theater. He was a 14-year-old kid working backstage. I was doing The Typist and the Tiger, and I never paid any attention to him. Then some years later, David had an acting part, and he was really terrible, just terrible. And we used to tease him about how bad he was, and he gave me a copy of a play to read called Duck Variations. And at that point, I realized that this guy was not an actor, but he was as great a writer as I was ever likely to meet.
Mike Nussbaum went on to appear in many of Mamet's plays and films.
Never saw a moment's violence.
Get it, wipe it down, and let's get out of here.
I swear to God, and you had to bring your squared John Broad into it. You had to bring your freak into the game.
Okay, it's happened. It's something that happened. It was an accident.
An accident? God damn you, you broke the first rule. I should have turned around the first moment you brought the broad.
I always like to tell the story that Mike Nussbaum remembers when he was in the Hull House Theater. He said he knew that something was going on when he didn't recognize any friends or relatives in the audience anymore.
And we create this tremendous audience, which I think, serves the city even to this day.
While Bob Sickinger was challenging and shocking his audience, Bill Polinzi was inventing a more crowd-pleasing pastime, dinner theater.
If you look back in history, in Shakespeare's time, they brought their lunches to the courtyard to see his plays. There were the German beer gardens where they would eat and have food and have nightclub-type entertainment. There were the supper clubs in the 40s. So this is just another step with legitimate plays. And now the concept is being copied even by legitimate theaters on Broadway. Everybody wants to go to dinner and a show.
Chicago was starting to get a reputation as a happening theater town. So in 1968, Stuart Gordon brought his small band of hippie actors down from the University of Wisconsin, where they had gotten into trouble for exercising a little too much artistic freedom.
That's right. We came from Madison, Wisconsin, and we had been getting harassed there because we did a production of Peter Pan that got us arrested. because of a nude scene. It's hard to imagine a nude scene in Peter Pan, but we managed to work one in. And Paul Sills had started the Body Politic on Lincoln Avenue, and June Pikasik started a theater called the Kingston Mines on the other side. And he said, if you move down here, there'll be 3 of us and we can call it a scene.
The Organic Theater's anti-establishment worldview and flair for inventive showmanship attracted audiences and critics and many young, eager Chicago actors like Joe Mantegna and Meshack Taylor and me.
How easily it whispers going on.
What really excited me was that they were creating their own work. They were basing material on, I mean, literally either comic books or perhaps some sort of strange dream Stewart would have had that week, or a novel, adapt a novel into a play. So in other words, it was really free form.
And we wanted to do something that was a little different from what was being done in Chicago at the time, because for the most part, the theater in Chicago was very, very traditional theater. If you did not already have a background in theater, there was very little likelihood that you were going to go to any of the theaters that existed here and be turned on to the art form for the first time. I think that our group and the groups that were down on Lincoln Avenue in the Kingston Mines and all around that area were the first groups to really bring counterculture theater to Chicago and to have it succeed on a large level.
I often run into people who saw some of those early productions who tell me that that was the reason they got into the business.
In this room, I remember seeing Bloody Bess with, you know, people swinging on the rafters and coins flying through the air and blood. John Ostrander hanging upside down with his neck slit open, bleeding into a pan on the ground. A great moment in theater.
We felt like we were doing something a little, you know, we were starting something.
You know, I still use the Organic Theater Company as a resource. If this play were being done by the Organic, what would it be like?
It was the beginning of what became the off-loop movement, which in essence has really become the, I think, what most people around the country and around the world look to as, you know, the real Chicago theater.
The Organic was also important because it offered opportunities to minority actors.
As a whole in Chicago, people really did not see theater as a place that anybody but white people was supposed to be working. And so when I went to the Organic Theater and we spoke about this, one of the things that we talked about was being able to do roles and not pay any attention to how the casting was supposed to be, or since we were creating our own plays for the most part, we would create parts for the minority members within our company that had just as much substance as anyone else's role did. And so that's how we dealt with that, and I think that really changed people's attitudes about how they saw minority actors on stage here in Chicago.
In true Chicago fashion, minority theater artists in this town have succeeded by making their own opportunities.
I still see his face, all twisted in pain. Day that stroke cut him down.
The reason for the company's existence was so that we could work. But primarily, you know, we were actually thinking of ourselves. We wanted to be able to work and control our own destinies.
Theaters on the north side maybe did their one quote-unquote black show a year. And we found that as artists, we were all scrambling up there just to try to do that one show. Well, we got kind of sick of that, and we decided that we would go back down to the south side.
On the near west side, this converted firehouse is home to the Latino Chicago Theater.
I don't think we're necessarily a part of the larger theater community in Chicago. I think in many ways we're separated from it, and that's a tragedy. But it was very important at the outset in that we had to create an incubator so that we could develop our own style.
And what we're saying is, even though there have always been stories told about us, there's nothing like the authenticity and the beauty and the joy of telling your own story in the way that it has been experienced over time. And so we call that speaking in the first voice.
I didn't learn my theater at the expense of having to unlearn my life. I didn't have to become like someone else.
We do seek out audiences of all colors and kinds because it's part of our mission to educate on a human level, not only on a color, which is highly important and part of our philosophy and dedication, but also on a human level. We need to know who we are as a people, what our samenesses are and what our differences are, and how to respect those sameness and differences.
Minority artists continue to work on breaking down barriers. Director Chuck Smith moved from the African-American Chicago Theater Company to the city's biggest and oldest resident theater, the Goodman.
Goodman needs more people of color in their audiences. No ifs, ands, buts about it. And hopefully I will help bring them in.
Like Chuck Smith, many Chicago artists dream of making it to the Goodman stage. This was definitely true of playwright David Mamet. Critic Richard Christensen was one of Mamet's earliest supporters.
He was a playwright who was able to use the language of the gutters and turn it into some kind of theatrical poetry.
You can't close the leads you're given. You can't close. You are. Hit the bricks, pal, and beat it, because you are going out.
The leads are weak.
The leads are weak. The fucking leads are weak. You're weak. I've been in this business 15 years.
What's your name?
You. That's my name. You know why, mister? Because you drove a Hyundai to get here tonight. I drove an $80,000 BMW. That's my name.
My writing was never separate from living in Chicago or working for that audience. I was specifically working for that audience. Because if I wasn't working for that audience, the audience wasn't going to come, and I was going to be back driving a taxi cab.
So when I read his stuff, it was like, oh yeah, I know. I mean, it's interesting. He writes like I talk, you know.
One of the reasons we wrote plays was we didn't have the money to pay royalties. It was prohibitive. I mean, when we found the St. Nicholas Theater Company, it cost $20 at that time to get a license from the state to incorporate. Nobody had $20, but everybody worked a straight job, you know, for 10, 12 hours a day, and then came to the theater. I played a lot of poker, and there were times, fairly good stretches when I made my living playing poker, and fairly good stretches when I didn't. The community support in Chicago was astounding. I remember this restaurant, the Escargot, was next door to our theater on Halsted Street, and they used to feed us. We were very, very poor, and we were a little bit hungry. And we would go in, you know, and order a beer, and Luciana or Alan would come on. So he has a plate of hors d'oeuvres, you know, and they just give us enough hors d'oeuvres to feed an army. And they never made a big thing out of it. They just thought it was a good idea to support that theater.
Through it all, Mamet kept his sights on Chicago's most prestigious resident theater.
I'd always wanted to get into the Goodman Theater because the Goodman Theater was it, and you couldn't get in. You were better to walk in off the street and say you were a New York actor and you forgot your resume than to give them 5 pages of what you'd done in Chicago. And Bill Woodman was then running the Goodman Theater, a good man and doing a very good job, and I brought him my play, American Buffalo, and he read it and said, not bad. He says, I really wish I could do it. Sorry, I can't. And I gave it to Greg Mosier, who was Bill's assistant, and he said, I'll do it tomorrow. And I said, well, probably need some rewrites. He says, do them or not, I don't care, I'm going to do this play tomorrow. And he did.
The play eventually went to Broadway, and Mamet found himself at the center of attention, discussed and decried, featured in magazines, and interviewed on television.
To be quite honest, I think there's only one thing that a playwright ever wants to hear when he or she picks up a review, and that's, I've never understood the theater until now. Thank God this person has opened my eyes. This is the dawn of a new American heritage. I can die now.
Did you get anything like that?
No, my ma.
American Buffalo began a string of collaborations between Mosier and Mamet, including a play about real estate hustlers called Glengarry Glen Ross. Joe Mantegna was thrilled to be a part of the cast until opening night. Then he experienced every actor's nightmare. He forgot his lines.
2 minutes into the play, for the first time in my life, I completely went up and had no idea where I was, who I was, what I was doing on the stage, and I had about 8 minutes left of a monologue. There was David Mamet's new play, opening night, and here's this putz up here who is looking like dumbly at the audience and doesn't know it. And so it was my worst theater experience absolutely in my life. And so from the most disastrous point of my career, it became the most triumphant part of my career when later on the ultimate success of that play, you know, came about.
Mantegna won the Joseph Jefferson Award in Chicago and the Tony in New York for his performance in Glengarry Glen Ross. The play won the Pulitzer Prize, and Mamet went on to write and direct many acclaimed plays and films featuring Mantegna and his other close friends from Chicago. If Mamet represents a theater of words and ideas, Steppenwolf is a theater of action and raw emotion. Steppenwolf rose from obscurity to conquer Broadway and focus international attention on Chicago. Their 1991 production of The Grapes of Wrath won the Tony Award for Best Play and Best Director.
Wherever you look, wherever there's a fight, those hungry people can eat. I'll be there. Wherever there's a cop beating up a guy, I'll be there. When our folks eat the stuff they raise and live in the houses they build, why, I'll be there.
In 1974, we called it Steppenwolf, and one of the guys was reading the book, and we needed something to put on the program, so he said, how about this? And I said, great, let's put that on the program, Steppenwolf Theater, and that's how it's got its name. We found a basement in a Catholic school in Highland Park. We built a little theater, it had about 88 seats, and we started doing plays the summer of '76.
It was only going to last for the summer. And I don't think anyone would have thought that 20 years later we'd be in a gorgeous building running a, $4 million budget. I mean, no one thought. It's still very hard to believe that happened.
Our primary focus was selfish, I think.
All we were trying to do was find really meaty, juicy acting parts.
I was really into Mean Streets and, Taxi Driver.
We were just trying to tear the characters apart. And we were young and had a lot of energy.
I remember the first season in the basement, Terry Kinney and I played these two young punks, hoodlums, who come upon it in the Indian wants the Bronx, who come upon a Hindu Indian in the middle of New York who can't speak any English and he's lost. And they terrorize this poor guy. And by doing that, we terrorized the audience a bit in our first season.
Gary told me that there was a little hill above the church basement, and when they knew their cue was coming, they would run down that hill and just burst into the theater through a side door, so that they were literally shouting and out of breath when they got to this guy. It is one of the few times in the times that I've been to the theater that I was really afraid for my life, because I thought after these kids got through with the guy on the stage, they were to come after me and everybody else in the audience.
I mean, at Steppenwolf, I learned after probably the first performance that you should probably not wear your best clothes to the theater here, that, you should probably not worry about what you look like, because you're going to get sand and mud and spit and makeup and sweat and any other possible thing on you during the performance, especially if you sit in the first couple of rows.
And it was always a big old, Peyton Place soap opera anyway, like who was with who at the time and who's, who's dating who and whatever. So it could get a little tricky, but we forced the good work out of each other because we weren't quick to settle for a performance.
And the winner is Laurie Metcalf.
We didn't get reviewed for the longest time, and I remember it was the Jeff Committee which finally came out and saw us way out in Highland Park, and that really was a big stepping stone for us. And then it wasn't long after that that we were able to move into the city.
My job in the 80s was to continue to challenge us and discover new places to go with this theater. And so one of the first things I did was put together our first play in New York.
You must have done something to him, threatened him or something. Now, what'd you do, Lee? I convinced him!
I had tried to get the rights for True West for 2 years. And they wouldn't give me the rights for 2 years, but finally I got the rights in 1982, and because I knew it was a good play for us.
We were just astounded because it was a rather weak period here, and I think what we loved was the physicality of that kind of acting.
If you choose to do True West and you choose to do it in a kind of a vicious way, I guess, or, you know, whatever style, whatever energy. I mean, yes, I guess you wouldn't choose to chug 6 beers in a row and then pee in the sink because it's not written in the play, but it kind of works for the play.
John did nothing different in that play than he'd been doing for years and years and years in Chicago, and having to drive a school bus at the same time to support himself, you know what I mean?
I remember hearing Malkovich say at the time that they were working in a church basement in suburban Chicago. No matter how good or how bad they would be, the next night they would be back in the church basement. So he said there was no reason to do this other than to do it as well as they could.
All John had to do was go to New York in one play, and all of a sudden he was the toast of American drama.
And every year for 6 years after that, we took another play there. The sense of accomplishment of having really built something from nothing is something that goes into your soul, especially something that has had an effect and an influence. You know, we were kids, you know, in a basement, you know, doing it for no money, and then we ended up building a building. Now, that's rare in American theater.
It must be hard for the Steppenwolf kids to think that they're, you know, hitting 40 and considered to be old fogies by a lot of the youngsters, but that is the case.
I think that right now is really among the first time in Chicago's history where a number of artists are reaching some sort of maturity as we're moving into middle age, or we've been working in the Chicago theater scene for 20 years.
Robert Falls is artistic director of the Goodman Theater, the quintessential insider. But he made his name in Chicago as a rebel at the tiny Wisdom Bridge Theater with his famous rock and roll version of Hamlet and a prison drama called In the Belly of the Beast, starring William Peterson.
I spent 10 years at a small theater throwing rocks at the Goodman. I think that the large institution is always going to be under scrutiny and fire.
And now that he's been at the Goodman for 7 years, how does he feel?
Quite peculiar, actually. I mean, because my image of myself is still, you know, the 22, 23-year-old who arrived in Chicago in the mid-1970s, you know, to work at Wisdom Bridge. And it's funny how it's hard to sort of shake that. And I still feel that Chicago is basically a young person's community.
One of the most talked about young Chicago ensembles is the Looking Glass Theater, a group of Northwestern University graduates breaking new ground with their athletic acting style.
I think that, for one, we have groups like Steppenwolf to thank because they've created a precedent for the idea that ensemble theater is exciting and something that is worth seeing.
Looking Glass presents bold theatrical adaptations of folktales, novels, and ancient myths.
Can you answer this? Did you foresee you saw 2 trapeze, right?
At this rehearsal, the company is working on an adaptation of the classic Russian novel, The Master and Margarita. They're learning circus skills, which they'll use to recreate many of the fantasy elements in the book, in this case, flying.
We were just exploring all the different ways of flight and leaving the ground and what suits the mood of each particular scene and what suits each character.
After only 6 years, Looking Glass has brought a dozen new artists to the attention of Chicago critics and audiences. Mary Zimmerman is one of those artists. She landed on the directing staff at the Goodman Theater, where her debut production won a Joseph Jefferson Award for Outstanding New Work.
Weight is a power created by means of force. And the length of its life corresponds to its effort to regain its native place.
Mary is a remarkable artist, and I think that she represents a sort of new generation of young theater artists.
She and Looking Glass, you know, who sort of grew up together, did the one thing that was really lacking in Chicago theater, one of the things that was lacking, which was the more abstract, the more dance-oriented kind of production.
That part of the woman which is exposed to the sun will appear bright in color in such a way that, in part, it will hurt your eyes as the sun does.
I have a real fondness for really old, dusty texts that have lived a long time. I find it really, really moving to work on something that's 2,000 years old, or this is 500 years old, and to realize that you're returning to the air words that were once in the air and then have since been calcified on the page.
We may therefore say that such an instrument of flying constructed by man is lacking in nothing. Lacking in nothing except lacking in nothing except the life of the bird itself.
I've shifted towards wanting to be entertaining. But I also know that a lot of the reason people stay away from the theater isn't necessarily because, oh, I can't afford it, but because there's a high probability that you might be bored. I think that plays that ask something of their audience in terms of, please help us imagine this, really involve the audience, and the audience really likes it.
Like Looking Glass and Mary Zimmerman, these actors who call themselves the Dogs are moving Chicago away from the cinematic realism of the 80s.
Yes, Mr. Charles? What kind of deaf mute are you, son? When I make a request over the PA, I expect... you should stay at the register and be nice to the customer. I expect you to follow...
The Dogs are an all-male troupe out of DePaul University. They pantomime their props and play multiple roles, including all the female parts. They also play animals and inanimate objects. In their recent production of Dogtown, they even created a human sound effects montage improvised from the city life around them. At this rehearsal, that included our sound man.
Man falling off the ladder in slow motion. I think it's my spine.
But there's something different about the Dogs. They were handpicked and put together by casting director Jane Alderman, a calculated use of the Chicago theater mystique to showcase hot young talent.
I don't think they're thinking of it actively as something to push them into the next level, and I most certainly am. That's what I brought them together for in the first place.
The Dogs and Looking Glass and dozens of other companies with names like Jelly Eye and Curious Theater Branch and Famous Door are keeping the Chicago scene alive and moving forward because they bring young, new audiences to the theater.
The Chicago theater scene is much more vital than what's going on in New York, because we're not dealing with all the huge institutions most of the time. We're not dealing with the incredible struggle for money.
What we're here to do this evening is an attempt to perform 30 plays in 60 minutes. Yes, everyone in the house have a long, thin sheet of paper. Hold it up, wave it around, make sure.
For 5 years, Greg Allen has been presenting the late-night audience participation show, Too Much Light Makes the Baby Go Blind. What Allen and many other artists say they find in Chicago is a place where they are free to concentrate on their art form and hone their craft.
There's a lot more freedom to really do what you want to do here. And that's why I think so many young theater directors and playwrights and actors come to Chicago.
People in New York just seem more pressured, and it's like every moment. It's every moment they're on stage. There's this concern with being the best one on stage, or, you know, having the most brilliant moment, or it just seems, they just seem a lot more tense.
You know, you do a play in New York and you've got 50,000 producers and casting agents and writers and playwrights and directors in the audience every night.
One Chicago director who was working in New York told me that every morning the actors would come into the rehearsal, call their agents to see if they'd gotten a better job.
Of course, for some artists, there are limitations to the Chicago way of doing things.
You can't be famous in Chicago, I don't think.
I think there comes a time when most Chicago artists feel the need to go and play at a bigger table.
You don't want to look back and say, well, geez, I was always scared of going to LA or New York, and I didn't. And I wondered if I would have ever gotten anything, you know.
I think the difficulty has been to mature, to have a career, to sort of maintain family and have longevity in the city. It's almost as if Chicago sort of puts a cap on the amount of growth that you can have. And I think that's a problem. I mean, I think that we can't simply judge ourselves by the vitality of 100 small theaters. I think we have to look at how the middle-range theaters are doing and how the more established theaters are doing.
The number of theaters has grown out of proportion to the amount of audience. We're all struggling for money. Of course, the grant money and the foundation money that all the not-for-profits go for is getting smaller and smaller all the time.
Looking at the forest instead of the trees, I think the truth is that there's a lot more money available to not-for-profits from philanthropic organizations and from individual donors now than there was 20 years ago. There's also a lot more theaters, not-for-profit theaters, chasing those dollars.
What's happening a lot in the bigger theaters is that it's getting harder and harder to take risks. It's getting more and more of trying to figure out in advance what the audience is going to like. And that leads to mediocrity.
Catherine Evans co-founded the Live Bait Theater. After 7 years, she and her actor husband, Doug Spinuzza, moved to the West Coast.
I think a lot of the older artists are getting tired of only going to a certain level in Chicago theater, and they have to leave. And I think the reason they have to leave is they cannot make a decent living here because there's not enough film work.
Ted Bales went to New York with the hit gay-oriented comedy Party, which first ran for over 300 performances in Chicago.
Give him something really good, like doing an erotic dance interpretation of Petula Clark's Downtown.
You can't have a career in this town. I mean, a long career. This sort of brash ethic that we've been talking about does not age at all. Because at 40, it doesn't look so youthful and exuberant anymore. It looks a little cheap.
Amy Morton now makes an annual trip to the West Coast to pick up film work like her Remains theater colleagues William Peterson and Gary Cole.
In your 20s, yeah, when you're supposed to be a bum and live in basements and, like, you know, eat macaroni and cheese every day and you like it, then yes, you can make enough money.
Maybe it's $5 a show. I mean, that's the type of money we're talking about here.
It's the most I've ever been paid.
And usually it's for free.
But you get into your 30s and you're like, you know, I'd like to not live in a basement anymore. You have to leave town to some extent.
Even some looking glass artists are already heading west. David Schwimmer had a recurring role on NYPD Blue and The Wonder Years, and is now a regular on the hit series Friends.
I felt that I deserved to be compensated for the profession I chose.
Looking glass artists can make as much as $125 a week, but producer Kate Churchill thinks it's just not enough.
If we were to pay people at what I would consider a decent rate, which would be, let's say $250 a week, okay? Which I still don't think is decent. Like, I think this company, these actors should be getting paid $500 a week. But anyway, get back to reality. $250 a week. That would, I think, it would triple our production budget as it stands now.
6 months after taping this interview, Kate Churchill herself migrated to Hollywood to find work producing for film. Is Chicago in danger of selling its artistic soul to Hollywood? Are some Chicago artists starting theaters just to train and showcase themselves? Critic Maura Troster resigned from her job at the Chicago Reader over just that issue.
I mean, I can't tell you how many times I've gone to a show in some mom-and-pop storefront theater, and it's been me, the theater critic, and the friends of the director. Who are these people doing this theater for? Is it for an audience? If it's for an audience, who is their audience? Or is it for themselves?
I really do feel a kind of oscillating energy back and forth, you know, between the community and myself.
Frank Galati is one of the many artists making a long-term commitment to Chicago. He's in residence at both the Steppenwolf and the Goodman. He teaches at Northwestern and directs theater and opera throughout the world.
I feel like I've been having an ongoing conversation with hundreds, maybe even thousands of people. I never in a million years expected that I would be able to work in the theater professionally in Chicago.
But it has happened for Galati and many other artists, like Paula Scorfano and her husband, John Rieger, best known for their performances in musical theater, like David Darlow, who performs in everything from Shakespeare at the Goodman to Neil Simon at the growing number of local commercial theaters, and Darlow's wife, Christine Thatcher, a regular at Shakespeare Rep and other top theaters.
When you go to an audition in Chicago, it is not unusual to hold somebody's baby while they go in to take their turn. And it seems to me that more and more actors are having families.
By joining Actors Equity, the Union of Professional Actors and Stage Managers, actors can work in the larger theaters for more money and benefits.
The working actor, the actor who works consistently and is not a name, is not a star, probably in this city can earn somewhere between $25,000 and $35,000 a year doing equity work.
There are good years and bad years, and you don't make all of your money from theater. There are films that come through the city, and or industrials or commercials or voiceovers. You pick up a few of those along the way to help subsidize your artistic goals.
I remember the days when I was an undergraduate at DePaul, walking through the streets late at night, dreaming about the remote possibility of having some theaters in Chicago where I could work without having to leave.
Today, Dennis Zacek can look back on 18 years at the Victory Gardens Theater, developing original plays like Beau Jest by James Sherman, which set new attendance records in New York and is now on stage in 34 cities around the world.
Now you can find actors of both sexes in their 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s who are, professionals and who have been able somehow to survive. I mean, not necessarily easily, but they're here.
And those of us who have left are well aware of what we learned in Chicago.
People are very, very willing in Chicago to give up the focus when it doesn't belong to them. And they're not so willing to do that in New York. And I remember I was doing a play, A House of Blue Leaves, with Stockard Channing, and I remember she said to me one time, "You're one of the most generous, you're probably the most generous actor I've ever worked with." And I said, "Why?" And she said, "Well, you keep acting even when you face up stage." I said, "What?" She said, "Well, most people, if they face up stage, they just drop out of it, you did." I couldn't believe it.
To this day, my costumer, my wardrobe people on my television show love me because I always hang up my clothes when I get finished. All my costumes always hung up when they come in here. But I learned that at the Organic because if it wasn't hung up and it was funky and wrinkled the next day, I had to iron it. It was like very, very difficult to make ends meet financially. But it's funny because I really think of those as the best years of my performing life.
I found, nostalgia aside, that it was simple there.
And in the end, those of us who leave are really just making room for the newcomers who keep reinventing Chicago theater. Like the young actors and their friends that Hetty Weiss saw at a recent Looking Glass Theater opening.
Everybody in sort of combination vintage and thrift shop and all of that. And I just thought, this is sort of what Glenn Headley and Malkovich looked like 10 or 12 years ago, So that means probably that, at least if they follow in Malkovich's path, they'll be wearing Armani's in 10 years. But
I think it's really appropriate that the great gift in theater is flowers. Everyone gives flowers, flowers, flowers opening night, because in a way that's a symbol of the play itself. It's extraordinarily beautiful, but it's going to fade and die really quickly. It has a very brief life.
Every time I step in front of the camera, I bring a little bit of Chicago with me. I'm very fortunate to have been a part of the Chicago theater story, the continuing story of Chicago on stage. So long.
Chicago on Stage was made possible in part by the Theater Years Chicago project of the Joseph Jefferson Awards Committee. Theater Years Chicago was partially supported by grants from the Illinois Arts Council, a state agency, and by the Illinois Humanities Council.